Such a privilege and a pleasure to participate here. And frankly, as you said, just watching this community grow over the last couple of years, you've just done such a masterful job. Well done. Hi, everyone. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for the gift of your time during obviously what is a very, very difficult times for us in the global community. I hope all you and your families are safe and pray that that continues. And obviously condolences to the many, many folks who have lost loved ones through this crisis. What I'd like to do over the balance of the next 25 minutes or so is to share a little bit of context with you on what led us to coin this phrase, achieving a sustainable reset. Share some research, some work that we've done with the World Economic Forum, as well as some ideas and examples of things you can think about and some resources that you can use as we look to adjust to today's reality, as we look to perhaps a future that may be, that hopefully will be a lot better, but certainly will not be back to where we came from. When we talk to CEOs and CHROs, and goodness knows I've had more than my fair share over the last several months as our clients around the world have begun to adjust to the present set of circumstances, there are a number of things that come out that we hear leaders are consistently grappling with. You know, obviously containing cost, doing so in a way that recognizes the need for continuous agility, because our responses, you know, from week to week are so very different because the circumstances have been changing so dramatically. Ensuring that we are continuously reducing risk to the operating model and ensuring business continuity where possible. Virtualizing work, we'll talk about that in a second. And then the thing that has been probably the most heartening to see, and those of us who've been around can probably relate to this, if you look back at the recessions of 92, 2001, 2008, it used to be that headcount reductions were one of the first items, if not the first item, on the list as organizations look to adjust to greatly reduce demand. And it's so heartening to see how organizations around the world, my own organization as well, that protecting the workforce is of paramount importance. Ensuring that we have a humane, a fair, and a compassionate response to managing the workforce is top of mind for so many organizations. I think, to me, that's probably been one of the most heartening things. And so when we talk about achieving a sustainable reset, I think our big opportunity and challenge is how do we balance the demands of different stakeholders, reset our business models in a way that ensures our organizations are able to adjust to a fundamentally different level of demand, but also ensuring, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, that we are building resilience in ways that we've never before thought about it. I mentioned the work that we've done with the World Economic Forum. On April 1st, we issued a report with the World Economic Forum called Achieving a Sustainable and an Ethical and Sustainable Response to the Workforce Challenges Posed by COVID, and it's available on the WEF's website. Underpinning that report were 5 key principles that we felt were really essential to achieving this sustainable reset. And I want to just spend a few minutes on this so you have a sense of the grounding for the beliefs that we've been articulating to the world. The first is understanding this as the defining leadership moment that it is. We've seen that, you know, this pivot, and the WEF has been talking about this. This was the focus in Davos this year, this pivot from focus on shareholder value to a recognition and an acceptance and an acknowledgement of all stakeholders in an organization's mission. Ensuring that when we talk about mission and purpose, that we are in fact staying true to those values, to those principles, and recognizing that this leadership moment requires and demands a culture of shared sacrifice that starts with the very top to ensure that we're protecting our most vulnerable employees. Effective leaders are those who are transparent, they're empathetic, they create trust, and their behaviors during this time of crisis help calm, support, and maybe even energize workers as they so that they feel vested in this common mission and purpose of the enterprise. As I touched on a second ago, we're in an extremely fluid situation, so it's imperative that we adopt an agile and continuous learning mindset to ensure that our responses are calibrated and recalibrated to the rapidly changing circumstances at hand. It goes without saying that we are in uncharted waters. It's not like we have a playbook we can rely on. It's not like we can look back at a previous recession and say, this worked then, it'll work again. This is all new. And so our ability to continuously experiment to learn what's working and what's not is going to be essential. I touched on this a second ago. It's going to be essential that we engage with, understand, and most importantly, I think, listen to the perspectives of all of our stakeholders, whether those are shareholders, employees, unions, works councils, healthcare providers, the broader community. And ensuring that we're keeping a pulse on all of those stakeholders is going to be critical. Fourthly, promoting that confluence of employee and company well-being. This is obviously a hell of a lot easier said than done. We know the cost pressures of the current revenue challenge environment. There are many of our organizations and organizations that we see that are going out of business as a result of the stresses being placed on the operating model. But ensuring that at that time we're also balancing the needs and the well-being of employees is going to be essential. And then lastly, ensuring that we're making decisions that take into account both the medium, not just the short-term effects of this crisis, but the medium and longer-term effects. Decision-making is obviously shifting rapidly, but ensuring that we are resisting the short-term actions that may seem expedient, that may seem important, but that threaten the longer-term viability of the enterprise and the employee experience that we have invested so much in building up. So 5 principles that we view as being sort of essential grounding points for this sustainable response to the future of work and to this crisis. I want to spend a few minutes on 4 potential action areas that we explored in this report and go a little bit deeper because they truly represent some pivot points to the world of work as we know it. Many of our organizations are grappling with this immediate and sudden pivot towards flexible or remote work. In the United States, about 35% of all work is able to be done remotely. And, we've been talking about flexible work arrangements for about 50 years now. Alvin Toffler wrote about the electronic cottages back in the early 70s. And unfortunately, every one of our homes has become one of those electronic cottages, right? As we connect with Zoom and Skype and WebEx and every possible technology out there. So we've gone from, about between 6 and 10% of all work that could be done remotely being done on a sustained basis remotely prior to this crisis to 100% of work being done remotely. I hear from our clients, small and medium-sized enterprises who never had a culture of remote work, who've gone to 100% remote work. And the questions that I'm hearing from them or the perspectives that they're bringing about are really interesting. It took us a while to get to 100% productivity with remote work, but we're there now. We've had to invest in lots of new infrastructure, maybe some new hardware, certainly better connectivity, a lot more cybersecurity, as a result of not just work being done remotely, but ensuring our employees who work remotely can access secure systems to keep doing their work. And we've made these investments. And the question that's being asked, which is really interesting, and it's one of many that are being asked, is, do we go back to our offices, that $1,000 a square foot piece of real estate, which used to be a place that we did work? Is that the best use of the space? Or is there a different purpose for that workplace? Is the purpose of the workplace less about doing work and more about collaborating with clients and customers, more about innovating, where there is value to us engaging and connecting with clients and colleagues alike? how do we now adjust to new social distancing requirements in the workplace, whether that's in factories? And there's some great examples of some of the things that have been done in Germany to get factories up and operating, albeit at much lower levels of capacity, maybe 70 to 80%, but with strict social distancing guidelines in a way that keep and preserve the health of employees. I think some opportunities to be for other countries around the world. Um, what work should be done back in the office? What work should be done, continue to be done remotely? And the thing that we've seen is that as organizations have adjusted this crisis, many have had ad hoc policies and ad hoc arrangements step in and are starting to ask the question of how do we transition to more permanent arrangements? And as you think about flexible work arrangements, there are 4 areas that consistently come up as organizations think through that. Certainly policy and programs, but that really may be the most visible, but it's really the tip of the iceberg. The enabling technology, is such a significant consideration, and probably the first thing that most organizations addressed at the start of this crisis. The question is it sustainable going forward? What are the work processes? That's probably going to be a major area of action going forward. What work should remain being done remotely for various reasons? What needs to come back to the workplace for various reasons? And where is there going to be a hybrid of actions whereby certain work remains remote within a job and other work is done back at the office? And then lastly, a leadership leadership mindset and culture that as it relates to ensuring that we are not sacrificing the cultures that bind and unite us, the cultures that align our workforce, distributed as they are and might continue to be, to our mission and purpose. So some ideas for you to think about. The second area that we're seeing some significant interest and action is rethinking our workforce strategy. We've seen across many industries this dramatic spikes and troughs as it relates to demand. We've seen significant spikes in healthcare and in select retail. We've seen massive declines in airlines and in hospitality. And as organizations look to deal with these spikes and troughs, the role of gig talent is becoming increasingly critical. And I'll go back to the point I made about resilience. There is growing recognition that our business models need to be much more resilient to these sort of massive shocks. Nobody believes that this will be the last pandemic. Nobody believes that we will not see a major shock like this, because arguably in the space of about 12 years, we've had 2 massive shocks to the global economy, with the financial crisis and now the pandemic, which is orders of magnitude greater than the financial crisis. So how do we ensure that our business models are resilient, that it can withstand some of those shocks, and where we perhaps give up some of the pursuits of efficiency in exchange for greater resilience? And the organizations that I'm talking to are recognizing that there is a role perhaps for gig talent to respond to these when situations where we are seeing some of these spikes in demand. But it's essential that the relationship between the organization and that gig talent be one that's ethical and responsible. And to that end, the World Economic Forum articulated a set of principles for what responsible platform work should look like. And I think they're a great starting point. The other key element in this equation is automation. We know from every recession, going back to the ones I talked about, we have come out of those recessions with more automation than we had going into those recessions. And unfortunately, as I've heard from a number of clients, well, the machines don't get sick, which is an unfortunate and perhaps callous response to the human crisis that we're facing. But the fact of the matter is that we need to ensure that we are automating responsibly. We need to ensure that we're thinking through the needs, as I said a second ago, of all the stakeholders, and not just thinking about automation being there to replace humans in work, but rather automation being there to ensure that we've got a much more resilient business model, one that achieves the optimal combinations of humans and machines, one which ensures that we are continuously reinventing work to substitute the highly repetitive rules-based work where we can take away errors and potential harm to humans, ensuring that we are adding new work and new tasks which require human ingenuity, and creating the cycle of perpetual reinvention within our organizations, and starting that now, not waiting for the next crisis. Another area of opportunity, and there's been a lot that's been said about this. I wrote an article for Forbes about 3 weeks to a month ago about this idea of cross-industry talent exchanges. My co-authors, John Boudreau, David Creelman, and I, back in 2015, in our book, Lead the Work, Navigating a World Beyond Employment, teed up this idea of cross-industry exchanges, not so much for cost mitigation like what we're seeing now, but rather to access skills that were difficult for certain industries to access. But we're seeing some great examples of industries that are seeing those troughs or declines in demand, redeploying their talent to industries that are seeing spikes. We've seen that in Germany, for example, where McDonald's and Aldi have exchanged talent. We've seen that in the United States with Kroger accessing talent from organizations in food processing that have seen declines. So an opportunity to share skills in a way that significantly minimizes the frictional cost associated with traditional employment transitions, where typically what would happen is if an organization had a reduction in force or a furlough, employees would have to go apply for unemployment insurance, they'd have to go apply for work, they'd have to have their skills assessed, they'd have to have background checks done, they'd then be deployed or be given shift schedules. And now what you've got is a much more seamless matching on an organization or B2B basis as opposed to the traditional B2C model. And then the last area of opportunity, if you will, is with so many employees being furloughed or potentially being sort of idled. We've spent a lot of time the last 5 years talking about the skills imperative, or skills as the currency of the labor market, and the need for us to reskill talent to address the shrinking half-life of skills. Many organizations have recognized that now is the time for them to upskill talent. Now is the time, as they, going back to my second point, as they reinvent work, as they bring on more automation, as they increase the digital intensity of work, now is the time to actually get talent upskilled. There are some great examples out there, for example, of what Shell is doing. Even at a time where it's reducing its operating costs by billions, it's continuing to invest significant resources in upskilling its employees in the oil fields to increase their digital skills. It's a great example of taking that longer term view. I want to give you a number of examples before we get into taking some questions of things that we're seeing with organizations out there. The first examples, or 6 specific examples on this page. The first is from an automation perspective. We've seen certain industries see massive spikes in demand for customer care, whether it's in financial services with banking, et cetera, or in insurance. We've seen one particular organization, immediately transition to adding chatbots and the use of RPA to improve the productivity of its call centers, to shift the talent that it has to dealing with the more variable, the more complex, the more human-to-human interactions, while having automation handle the more repetitive rules-based work. We've seen organizations shift to using non-traditional talent. So an energy distribution company we work with, identified the work of its advisors on the trading side of things to be able to sort of move that work to freelance talent as those advisors sort of got transitioned to take on other work. We've seen in the retail sector, for example, the redeployment of talent from home offices and headquarters down to customer-facing sites and the like. Making work portable, ensuring that, in this case, it's a financial services organization that was looking to sort of move work in its central services teams to creating more agile teams and allowing for that work to be done in different places by different teams who may have excess capacity, while some teams have, too much work. Shifting where of work, where the work is actually done. A very large utility has shifted its field operations data collection work that used to be done by a lot of employees in the field as a result of social distancing and as a result of concerns about the safety of their workforces, shifting that data collection work to the use of sensors and being done remotely in data centers. Shifting when the work is done. We've seen this happen in a variety of countries around the world, such as creating split schedules of work, such so that you've got same teams operating in common shift cycles to minimize on-premise exposure to risks where the work needs to be done on site, but we also need the space and time to keep cleaning the facility. And then lastly, this point about borrowing and lending talent. The example here is of an airline that where their baggage handlers who have very like skills to those of e-commerce logistics roles in the retail sector. And that talent is being shared en masse from airlines to some of those retail roles. And just today, my colleagues and I published an article in the Harvard Business Review that illustrates some of these ideas and this critical imperative we have about needing to reinvent jobs in order to capture these opportunities going forward so that we come out of this crisis with that sustainable reset. One last thought that I will leave with you is as you are looking to achieve the sustainable reset and ensuring that you are deploying work to the right talent, the right cost, 3 steps to think about. Doing some immediate analysis to identify where could we deconstruct work to identify some immediate cost-saving opportunities. Where could we take a workflow, deconstruct it, identify what work could be deployed to different options, and quickly identify, are there lower cost options immediately? And then secondly, asking the question of for our business model, as we come out of this crisis, where do we need to be great versus where do we need to be good? Where does it make sense to have talent where there is a premium on certain types of skills as we start to come out of this trough, where we're going to need to ensure that we're deploying our best talent to that work? Where could we potentially move that talent from to the areas which are going to be demanded? What's the impact on total rewards, for example? Could we change the mix of total rewards in order to achieve a more sustainable reset? Many years ago in 2001, after the 9/11 crisis, we did some work with a global airline where they were using total rewards optimization, which is a technique many of you are familiar with, not with the goal of asking employees the question of what would make you more productive or what would make you stay longer. Rather, they use total rewards optimization with the goal of what is most equitable. What is the most equitable way for us to reset our cost structure? And where should those savings come from? Should it come from pay? Should it come from medical benefits? Should it come from retirement benefits? Should it come from other interventions, incentives, the learning and development infrastructure? But in giving employees a chance to provide a voice to these cost containment discussions is going to ensure that our response is a much more accepted one. And it goes back to the earlier point about engaging stakeholders. And then lastly, embedding this notion of reinvention, not just in 1 or 2 areas, but across the organization, so that we are building a business model that is far more resilient than the one that we are coming out of this crisis with. The last thing I lied. The last thing I will leave with you is I want to point you to some resources that are on the Willis Towers Watson website. My colleagues and I have spent a lot of time thinking through in our conversations with clients, 3 areas of concern that we're hearing. One is, how do we manage through this crisis? How do we react? How do we adapt? How do we sustain the changes that we're making? How do we restore stability as certain parts of our operating model reopen? If we're in Asia, in China specifically, we're restoring stability and perhaps even getting back to operating post-crisis. Italy and Spain are certainly in the restoring stability phase. So what are the interventions that we need to be thinking about? And those interventions, as you can see at the bottom of this page, cover 7 areas. We've talked about the work and pay implications, but obviously there are a ton of others around health and well-being, around retirement, managing the employee experience and communications, and culture. And so if you go onto the willistowers-watson.com website, you'll see this roadmap that I hope will be helpful to you, and it'll have many of the ideas that we've talked about. Enrique, I would be delighted to take some questions if you think now's the time.
Yeah, fantastic. Ravin, thank you so much. Very enlightening conversation and ideas. And we do have a number of questions from the audience. And for everybody who is tuning in right now, please post your questions in the chat and we will try to bring them to the table. There are a lot of things going on in there, so I'm going to try to focus on a few of them. Ravin, as you said before, this is not the first time that the world is in crisis. We learned of a recorded pandemic in history in 1918. Then we've gone through the Great Depression, the wars, 9/11, Ebola, H1N1. So, and we're back in a place where it's evident that there's a lack of preparation for these kinds of things. And we may be in a little bit of a better place than we were before. And yet, like you mentioned, many of our business models are not ready to cope with this level of disruption. So I want to ask you a couple of questions. Is it even possible to create a business model that is prepared for something like this? And if that's the case, how does it look like? What does the business model look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of my colleagues and I are writing an article for that we hope will be published sometime soon about the need for this premium uncertainty. And if you think about it, Enrique, there are, certainty is a function, obviously, of the business model, but it's also in many respects a function of the industry. But it's also a function of how management chooses to use its resources. If you're building a more resilient business model, the things that you do are, if you're in a very volatile industry, you reduce the amount of, and so very volatile industries you may have a lot of what's called high operating leverage, right? There's a lot of variability in your operating model. And what you do to drive more certainty is you'd reduce the amount of financial leverage that you have. So you hold greater cash reserves. You don't necessarily engage in stock buybacks and the like. But what you do is you hold greater cash reserves, which allow you to weather the storm. You don't take on a ton of debt, but instead build up a much less leveraged financial position. Now, it's interesting because, I was talking to a couple of clients in the insurance industry, and the insurance industry was not sexy for a long, long time because they were not moving quickly. It was not where the action was. But it's an unfortunate byproduct of this, or maybe fortunate if you're in the industry, is the stability that comes from that sector. Most of those organizations are incredibly well capitalized. They manage their businesses in a very conservative manner because of perhaps the regulations that surround that industry. And I think there are lots of lessons to be learned about that. Now, it's going to require, to my opening points, significant trade-offs, right, Enrique? Because it's the recognition that I am not going to pursue that next dollar for the benefit of my shareholders. Rather, instead of getting that extra dollar, my shareholders might only get that extra 20 cents because I'm going to create a much more resilient business that can withstand some of these shocks. Now, I don't think we could withstand any shock, but arguably, if we thought about financial leverage and operating leverage in this way, we'd have much more sustainable models than what we see today, certainly in our country.
Fantastic, and of course, the hope for business leaders, but for everybody else who depend on on companies running successfully and smoothly. I mean, we want this to happen. We want these organizations to be sustainable and to have the right business models in place, because otherwise everybody suffers. We got 22 million people unemployed right now in the United States, and it's probably going to go up to 30 million based on the most recent research. So having unsustainable business models is not just a matter of whether that company can, create revenue and stay alive throughout time is what happens with the thousands of people that they are employing, right?
Right. And to that point, it becomes a tax on society as a whole, right?
Yes.
Because the need for us to then bail out, any particular industry or particular companies within an industry is significantly mitigated. And so you've got less of that burden on the rest of society.
Yeah. So I know I was interviewing somebody recently and we were talking about the role of leadership in both increasing engagement in the workplace, but also building agile organizations and agile teams, which is pretty much aligned with some of the things that you are commenting on. We know that sometimes leaders miss the train and they miss the opportunities to build or to rebuild and rethink about those business models. For the average citizen of corporate citizen, what can they do individually to help their organizations become more resilient, sustainable, and to transform their business models for crises like this going forward? So that, not only if you had a position of leadership, but for everybody else.
Yeah, it's a great question, Enrique. And, many really thoughtful leaders have been making this point about why reskilling and upskilling is so important. And I think when I've seen the response of people, the general public has been like, wait, why is reskilling important when I'm trying to sort of put food on the table? I sort of get that, right? But the reason reskilling and upskilling is important is because one of the biggest risk factors in organizations today, right, is our legacy high frictional cost model of one set of qualifications matched to one person, matched to one position. What you do then is you have these false boundaries within the organization, and it creates very high risk or operating leverage in the business model. Because the alternative, which is maybe nirvana, is a completely agile team. An agile team which has many different types of qualifications with many different matched to different skills, and those skills can be matched to all of the work of the company. So the teams can swarm to work as it happens. As some things increase, teams can swarm in that direction. They can get upskill quickly and swarm to that. If some things decrease, they can swarm away from it. What you don't have are the frictional costs and the silos that stop the seamless deployment of resources to work. And I think from a leader perspective, agile is essential because you need to reduce the frictional cost and the boundaries. From an individual perspective, you ought to be continuously looking to expand your skill sets. If I'm sitting in HR today, are there skills that I can learn related to strategy and finance, particularly as the future of work is calling for the convergence of some of these skills? It's creating new demand for skills. If I'm sitting in HR today, do I understand the new technologies that are reshaping work? Yeah. Those should be areas I want to look at because it's going to make me more relevant, not just within my company, but obviously elsewhere.
Yeah, and then you can also make the case for the amount of information that is created now. And if you continue to have the business models that rely on traditional hierarchical structures, the flow of information is extremely slow. So I just imagine, even in government, if you think about it, knowing about the coronavirus back, in November or December, and then only acting upon all these things, in March. I mean, that tells a story of, how heavy the hierarchies are and how slow information could move and the implications that that pace of, information flow could have in the future of our country or countries in the world or organizations. So let me connect that question to this idea of operating for different kinds of sizes of organizations. I mean, there are some organizations that have, yes, heavier hierarchical structures, but they have a lot of resources that they can dump into any initiative that they have. But there are smaller organizations that may be more agile, but they have less resources to pivot from one place to the other. Mm-hmm. So what's, based on all the conversation that we've had about sustaining, changes, over time, what's your message for different sizes organizations, small, medium, or large size organizations? How can they do these things based on their level of circumstances and reality?
Yeah, that's a great question, Enrique. And the thing that I hear from the large organizations, we'll start with those to begin with, right? Because they have, for want of a better phrase, the burden of legacy, right? They've got their legacy structures, and it's very difficult to move beyond that. And many of them, the ones who do this well, they're starting to create cultures of continuous experimentation. How do we keep experimenting? How do we embed agile in one part of the business? How do we learn from that? To your point about communication, how do we keep sharing information across the organizational boundaries so it's much more seamless? So we can start to see what's working and what isn't. We can collectively learn. How do we change our culture from one of, quote unquote, punishment for mistakes to one of recognition and rewards for continuous learning and experimentation? There's a great case study that was written in the Harvard Business Review. It was in my last book called Reinventing Jobs, and it's the story of Haier. Haier is probably the largest appliance manufacturer in the world. They're based in China. And the thing that is fascinating about this company, they're a global company. They're based in China, but they bought GE's appliance business a number of years ago. The thing that is fascinating about this organization is that it had all the legacy you could want, right? GE's appliance business is about 120 years old. So there are few organizations with that sort of legacy. But they basically reinvented their organization to go from a traditional assembly line, hierarchical command and control enterprise to being one where work is deployed into 200 micro businesses. And instead of the corporate center controlling information and resources, etc., it only does two things. It helps each of those micro businesses access talent from within and outside the company, and to access funding, both from within the company and elsewhere. And so you've got these empowered teams that are then supported by HR and finance in getting the resources they need to respond in a very rapid way. And if they're not succeeding or their business cases aren't good, they don't get the resources they're looking for. It's kind of an extreme example, but to me, it's a great example of what's possible with a large enterprise. I think with smaller enterprises, continuously striving to break down the silos that invariably will start bubbling up as you grow, as you get bigger, as you look for more technical, maybe deeper technical experience. I think that's probably the biggest challenge. How do we stay nimble and agile?
That is fantastic, and great examples of what's possible. And there's actually a book, I think Benjamin Sander, is called The Art of Possibility, and it's all about thinking about what's possible. And I don't know if you would agree with this, but in normal circumstances, sometimes somebody bring an idea to the table and you say, you know what, that idea is too far-fetched, too crazy, we can't do that. But right now we're in a time where if we want to survive and thrive in the future, we gotta be open and welcome all of those ideas, as crazy as they sound. They may not be implementable, and that's something that will be analyzed eventually. But I think it's a great opportunity to open up the organization to let people come with any idea that can either help transform large organizations or make the smaller ones nimble and agile. So no, this is fantastic. We have a couple of very tactical questions. One of them is if you have seen productivity growing in companies that went fully remote.
Boy, that's a great question. So what I've seen is a graph that looks like this, right? If you can see. So this will probably look backwards to, maybe let me go this way. So this is where productivity was, at 100%, right? So if this is 100%, here's what it was back in the office. And then when the crisis hit, it kind of did this, right? It fell off a cliff, but then it very quickly recovered. And I would say it's maybe about 80% of where it used to be today, because so many companies went very rapidly from, oh my gosh, we've never done remote work, to we're 100% remote. So let's get Zoom, let's up our cybersecurity. And so companies quickly got back to close to the same levels of productivity. Now, that's obviously true for remote work, right? The impact on in-person work has been huge and absolutely negative. But I think for remote work, we're pretty close to getting back to it. And it's fascinating, in Winston Churchill's words, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And necessity being the mother of invention. It's been fascinating to see so many organizations get really creative about how do we get back to work? How do we give my employees who have to deal with elder care and childcare when they're at home the space to do that and to work? I don't know if it's going to be fully sustainable, but I think there's been a lot of creativity in the short term to get back to close to 100%.
Yeah, no, and it's fascinating to see companies. I think there's a pizza company, and all they do is sell pizzas. Whether it is delivery or in-house, which they can't do that anymore. So now they are selling kits for people to make pizza at home. So it's not only that they're selling the pizza, they are selling the ingredients for people who make pizza at home. I mean, this is a mundane example, by the way. It's like, anybody can think like, wow, that's so so basic, but this company wasn't doing that before, and now it's making money out of that one creative, simple, mundane idea. Yes. And I mean, they have the ability to be nimble, but it's what you're saying. Now we are in a time where, a lot of companies are getting really creative, and they are trying different things to see what works. Ravin, one more question before, we wrap up our conversation today. If you were to say a couple of things, actions that organizations, leader, or the ordinary citizen, corporate citizen could do to make the best out of this tragedy that we're going through right now, but also to prepare themselves for what's coming after, what would those things be? Maybe a couple of, straightforward recommendations.
Yeah, let me give you two, Enrique. One is, if you're someone who is finding that, your work, you've either been furloughed or you haven't got work, the best thing you can do is to obviously invest in yourself, acquiring some new skills. There are so many digital resources out there, many available at very low to no cost. I know a number of organizations who, as they've furloughed employees, they've continued with their access to, Coursera, lynda.com, etc. Make maximum advantage of that. Take maximum advantage of that. If you can close your skill gaps, if you can acquire new skills, you are going to be so darn attractive to not just your employer, but to many others when things start to get back, and when, demand for your work is back. I think that's one thing. I think for organizations, think beyond the tried and tested, right? The thing that I worry about with companies is they go back to the old playbooks. We're going to look at furloughs, we're going to look at RIFs, and it's one size fits all. What we're finding is if you look at this page, this idea of, if we can take a workflow and reinvent it and say, you know what, we spend $1 million with all of this work being done today. We find that certain tasks, which might require, for example, robotic process automation, we already have RPA being used in finance. Could we not deploy that technology to take on some of this work and thus free up our capacity so that people can do something else? I think we really need to think outside the box. And that's why I keep repeating this. A sustainable reset doesn't mean just taking out costs. It means reinvention. And I think if you don't do that, all you're going to do, you'll come out of this crisis no better than you were going into it. So two things for people to think about. And again, that playbook that I mentioned is freely available, and I think you'll find some use. Business leaders and HR leaders will find some useful ideas covering all of these 7 areas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And not only, one thing that I have been saying, at least since the beginning of the crisis here in the United States at the beginning of March, is that it's going to be not only a wasted crisis, but it's going to be wasted, and a missed opportunity to see all the suffering and all the pain that we're going through if we end up in the same place where we were before. Exactly. I mean, we're going through some darkness now, and people always say, I want to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I am hoping that not only do we see the light, but that we create that light, because it has to be different from the light that we left behind.
Yes.
Because it was not working. It was not working for everybody. I mean, we see now 22 million people lost their health care, and there's no safety net for small to medium-sized organizations. Right now, the PPP program that was put together by the government, at least here in the United States, you have organizations that have incredible amounts of money sitting in their bank accounts, and they are still accessing those resources that were meant for the smaller organizations. So, we gotta, I think, part of this sustainable reset is to think, without any political gridlocks or mental sort of preconceptions, what makes sense, right? I mean, we have to leave some of those dogmas aside and come together to the table and think about the things that were not working for everybody and the changes that we need to make going forward. Because otherwise, whenever there's another COVID-19 or COVID-20 or whatever it is, we're probably, we don't want to end up in the same place. Anyway, Ravin, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much once again for dedicating your time so selflessly to share your ideas with us in Hacking HR. As usually, it's a privilege to have you with us. And for everybody who's connected online, we're coming back in 10 minutes. We have 2 panels talking about the sustainable reset today, and the next panel is coming up in 10 minutes. Please stay tuned. Thank you so much, Ravin.
Thank you, Enrique. Thanks, everyone.